archetypal development is that you understand the archetypes that you like to step into and are comfortable with, and you can describe any behavior archetypally, going down with that if you have an archetypal lens to have. And you skip the sort of the psychological and the why and the this one did this to me and so forth. And you have a direct tool and access to something extraordinarily powerful to change your behavior and to find out why on a much deeper level. Because you can say, I recognize the archetype. Here's how I would like to live that archetype. There are no good or bad archetypes. There are no good or bad planets. There's ways to live all of them that are good and that are bad.
Laurence Hillman, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Brian. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to finally meet you. Um, I wonder if we could just start a little bit by talking about your upbringing with this guy who's been a big figure in my life, James Hillman, and what that was like. I've been trying to imagine it because I grew up in probably a very different kind of environment, and had to kind of really reclaim my imagination later in life. But I'm wondering what it was like for you.
So for me, I grew up in Switzerland, where my father was studying with Jung and then became the director of studies at the Jung Institute in Zurich when I was born and several years before and during. And so, it was an interesting life. As a friend of mine once said, I was marinated in archetypes, which is really a good way to put it. My imagination was always encouraged, and to not take things too literally was always a big part of the conversations. That's really what I remember the most. I also had the fortune of going to a Rudolf Steiner school, which is the Waldorf school here. And so, mythology and imagination and stories of all kinds, we learned all the Grimm fairy tales, all the Greek myths, all of it was a part of my earliest education, which really set the stage for me to be very comfortable in my imagination and deal with images all the time, which was my father's big thing. So, other than that, as a father, he wasn't very participatory. He was very much in his own world. People who want to know about that life and about growing up in Switzerland and all of that, I point them to Dick Russell's 3-volume, beautiful biography of my dad, which is excellent and really quite an interesting read. So that's pretty much what I have to say. And it's set a way of being very comfortable with my imagination. I guess that's the main thing, not to take things too literally.
So before we started recording, you mentioned that you have a daughter, and I'm just wondering, like, for parents who want to raise their children with their imagination intact, what advice might you give?
So, I did the same things raising two daughters, and it was, giving them, not having a television that was allowed except for PBS and some cartoons that was good for kids, I thought. And so giving them as much storytelling time as I could come up with, telling them stories that I made up, not just reading books, but, pointing to things in nature, playing with them around imagination and the reality of the things that they couldn't see, and that what they couldn't see or measure was just as real, to the point where, kids are skeptical. What do you mean there's a fairy out there? Well, go look better. Oh yeah, there it is, and there's those kinds of ways of accepting the imagination. I'll give you a practical story. And this is actually a memory from when I was a kid with my dad. So let's say I woke up in the middle of the night and I had a nightmare. And, I'd come running into my parents' room and crying and I all frightened. And so I remember this time when my father said, so tell me about it. So I said, well, I dreamt of a big white horse, scary big white horse. And my father, like, oh my God, white horses. I love white horses. You know what? They really love, what they love to drink? They really like milk. Let's put some milk out. And when the white horse comes back, maybe, it'll drink it. And I get all excited as a kid. So we go to the kitchen, we get a plate, we put some milk on it, we put it in the room. And, now I really want to go back to sleep because maybe it'll come back. So it changes the story. And of course, when I wake up, miraculously, it's gone. How exciting,
Hmm.
So the white horse came to visit. And so instead of making those things, what the normal parent would do is turn on the light and say, look, you're just imagining things. It's not here. It's not scary. Everything is fine. Well, as a child, that is absolutely real to you.
Hmm.
And it's just as real what's happening in the dream, which, of course, we wake up sometimes as adults and have memories of dreams that are so powerful. We need to first sort of adjust to the reality that we're here, especially if they're traumatic or if they're PTSD kind of dreams. And so to this veil between reality and what other people call not reality, I think that's just as real, the imaginal world. That veil was very thin in my upbringing, and that's just a practical example. And I suggest to parents to do the same thing because it is really useful to have access to that imagination.
Mm. One of the other things that I talk about sometimes is like reading kids those old fairy tales, like the Grimm brothers fairy tales, some of which can be fairly ghastly. The morality of them is very ambiguous. And I remember reading Bruno Bettelheim's book on enchantment, and he was really making a what would you say? He was advocating for reading children these stories, which could be scary. Um, what's your view on that? How does that prepare a child for life?
Yeah, I think that shielding our children is one of the big problems of our time. And the thing with the trophies that everybody gets a trophy when you go to soccer camp, and it's not real life. And so that's detrimental to the child. So letting children experience pain and suffering and without trying to shield them from it helps them actually be resilient. And kids today, particularly, in their 20s and Gen Zers in particularly, are not very well equipped for this sometimes very mean and brutal world. And so we can't shield them, once they go out. The best thing we can do as a parent is make them ready for the real world, and the real world isn't friendly all the time. It is at times, but to give an idealized version that's not true, and that the fairy tales are very, they express archetypal realities that are deep-seated and understood anywhere. And I think it's great idea to give kids these stories and learn them how to deal with the fact if they get frightened. By the way, usually it's the adults who get frightened and put in the morality and all that stuff, and kids don't at all. They have a very different attitude to the stories, and they think it's exciting, kind of covering your eyes while you look through your fingers, that kind of a thing. There's an enticement to these stories, which is why they've lasted. And what is the enticement? It is that they're universal and they're archetypal. We all get them. We understand what they're trying to tell us on a deep level. And the moral of the stories are valuable because, moralizing a fairy tale is it's an outside judgment to its own inner logic. So trusting that the story itself has something to offer is a really important part of going at it, not trying to censor it again as a way of shielding or protecting or not giving the wrong idea to kids.
Hmm. Yeah.
These fairy tales are universal. They've been around forever, and they are, universal themes. Beauty and the Beast as an archetypal story has been around forever. You can go back to the Greeks and Venus being married to I mean, Aphrodite being married to Hephaestus, the ugly guy who made the weapons for the gods. Venus, I call her Venus because I'm an astrologer, but it's the same thing as Aphrodite archetypally. And so that's one place you find them. You find these in other cultures. The Chinese cultures have a Beauty and the Beast story. They have wherever you go in the world, you find these stories because that idea of matching opposites, the alchemical process of the conjunctio of bringing those two opposites together is a very deep part of the human psyche, and we do it all over the place, and we try to do it, and we have to do it as a way to exist. So you find that learning and that teaching in these stories. It's a great tool to teach kids. Give them as much as they can handle and as they're willing to, and stretch them a little bit, I believe. It makes them resilient.
Mm. Yeah, there's something about that story in particular, Beauty and the Beast. It strikes me as like there's a message there about like seeing through the surface presentation
It's
of a person or a thing, of a situation, almost like innately thinking psychologically in a way.
Yeah, maybe. And it could also, I think that's probably part of it. It's also partially for me the externalization, when I see my own inner beast, when I'm considering myself the beauty and I see my own inner beast and fall in love with my own inner beast, that's a lovely thing. Or if I'm the beast, I fall in love with my own inner beauty. And so there's a connection about we externalize our archetypes all the time. We find people to play those parts, when we don't really have access to them, these inner roles that are all within us. And so psychology calls that projection. I prefer externalization because I think of them as actual characters. And so seeing them in the world as actual characters is a literal form of making that inner life visible that is practical and useful, I find.
Hmm. Yeah. And I wonder, like, so one of the things that I try to understand is how let's say, psychological insights are received through reading a story, because it's done on a different level than the interpretive mind. And also, like, it's related to a sense of meaning. And I noticed that we use the word sense. So it's not a cognition necessarily, but it's like a felt sense of meaning. And I find it often very hard to put my finger on it or to verbalize like why something is meaningful, or drawing out a particular insight is often a struggle for my mind to find the words to express what I feel. What do you like? What is that sense?
I think we have, and especially as children, since we're talking about kids here, especially children have a much less ruined sense of what's right and wrong and of morality and of what's fair and these kinds of things. I think as adults, we get a lot of our creativity and sort of this natural sensing knocked out of us by belief systems of all kinds, or, religious, political, whatever they may be, by our parents. And so the creativity is literally taught out of you, and the teaching system that we have is horrendous and does not support imagination and fantasy because that's unreal and it's not measurable and therefore it doesn't exist. And so it's just a waste of time, and daydreaming is bad, these kinds of things. Meanwhile, anybody who's ever created anything clever in the world throughout history has been, basically we can call, her a daydreamer. So this idea that we have to conform and take on rules by others limits um, the trust that we should put in our own innate sense that is quite strong when we're young. And kids have really strong sense about, what's fair in a play or in a game. It's like they get really emotional about it because they sense they have that inner compass that's quite good. So we need to maybe listen more to the justice sense the kids have than that we have as adults of what we think is right and wrong based on our own, whatever superficial rules we put in, and not think of kids as just a blank slate that needs to be filled up with all our scribbles, but there's actually something there in the innate moment, which takes us right into the astrological idea of and the acorn idea of what is the story the kid comes with. In the Japanese tradition, the idea is that the kid is a complete blank slate, and it's the adult's job to fill it up. And there's a lot of people who believe that in other countries and other cultures as well. But in our viewpoint and in the more ancient viewpoint of coming in as an acorn, the Platonic notion of the of the moment of beginning containing the rest, is to me a very different attitude, and that takes listening and watching and observing and recognizing in the child as opposed to trying to feed it the stuff that we think it needs.
Hmm. Hmm. How important do you think it is for us to have a kind of let's say, a working cosmology, like something like the acorn theory, or um, astrology in that Platonic sense, the soul passing by the planets and picking up these attributes?
Mm.
I've been thinking about that a lot in recent years, and I think it's actually like incredibly important, especially if you're kind of a secular or post-religious, post-Christian person, and the kind of the cultural myth no longer fits. I found it like really helpful to me to have developed a kind of a cosmology or even a mythology of my life.
Well, you're asking an astrologer, so do I think it's important? Of course I do. It is my way of living. And so astrology to me is not what I do, it's who I am. It's a way of being. And it basically means, well, let's get really broad. Philosophically, I think there are three ways to go through life. The first way is to say life happens to me. That is a rather common attitude. A lot of people say that, this happened to me when I was a kid, and if I'd only had this or this because of this, I'm now like that. In other words, I'm a victim. Life
Hmm.
happens to me. I have no control. Things just happen. The second way to go through life is saying, I make life happen. That's an ego approach. It's actually quite an American approach, having lived in other countries and knowing other cultures quite well. This is quite American, manifest destiny, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, do your own thing. You're in charge. Anyone can be president. These kinds of ideas are very American. Take your gun, go west, young man, and take what's yours. That's like make your own life. That's up to you. Nobody's going to help you. Just do your own thing. So that's
The
the second.
heroic fantasy.
The heroic fantasy of the hero, correctly, and that's a very that's an ego-based approach to I make life happen. The third way, which I, espouse to live by and often succeed, not even mostly, but often succeed, is that life was already happening. It is my job to find out what's happening and then to co-create with the energies that are present to me at any given moment. That means paying attention to what's happening. And to be able to do that, we need a cosmology. We need a way to understand what's happening. And if we are, if we believe if we're monotheists of some kind, then we might say, well, God wants this to be, and therefore it is like this. Not a lot of people, well, still a lot of people, but there are many people who no longer accept that as a truism. So they need another cosmology to give them that sense of, well, what is happening? How do I read? And how do I know what's happening and what's in my life? And for that, there are different ways to do that. You can meditate, you can do tarot readings, you can do all kinds of different tools. And I use astrology as a tool to understand what's happening in real time in the world, and then how I can best adjust myself to this energy that's present at any given time, which changes constantly. And how do I adjust myself? So it's almost like knowing what the weather is like,
Hmm.
and then knowing if I want to wear an umbrella, if I want to wear, rubber boots and an umbrella and take an umbrella with me, or if I want to go and lie in the sun, or if I want to go and set my sails a certain way so my boat doesn't get blown over because I know how the wind is blowing. That's really helpful. So for that, it's a really good tool. It's very practical. It's very applicable. It's not very abstract, and it's not very mysterious. It can be totally understood as long as a person opens up their, right brain capabilities, which we all have, but have again been educated out of us by turning on the light switch every time and saying, no, look, it's just your imagination. So we need imagination to speak this language. We need right brain capabilities to learn how to read nature and
Hmm.
what's going on around us. And then we can co-create and we can say, okay, well, with my personality, now would be a really good time to do XYZ because the winds are blowing this way and I really want to do that. Cool.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems to me like it's a kind of a Taoist approach, like trying to move with the flow of life as it's
Exactly.
coming. Yeah, learning how to surf the waves so you
Exactly.
don't so you don't
That
drown or get pummeled on the rocks.
exactly. Very, very good metaphor. And it's not that we are being we're not victims to this. We can co-create with this work. That's a big difference in how it's like there's all these opportunities every second. And to me, enlightenment is when you're totally in the moment at any moment without any sort of being elsewhere. So, cell phones don't really help when we are constantly elsewhere. And so being in the moment totally and co-creating with the energy that is present for me right now, wherever I am, that is, um, to me, that's the ultimate goal.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think like sometimes when people talk about being in the moment, that they exclude like daydreaming, fantasizing, or remembering. And for me, I had to kind of do away with some of the yogic training that I received about being in the present moment and putting aside any other kind of, thinking about the future or thinking about the past. And for me, it was a realization that, well, I'm being present in the moment of remembering, and there's a link between the past and the present that I am in and I'm engaged with and paying attention to. So it's like a way of like reclaiming value of fantasy, remembrance, and even intuition and imagination, because these things have been either devalued by the kind of the Protestant Christian culture that that I grew up in, or like even the New Age kind of non-dual spiritual kind of movement. And there's a middle ground there that I think is what we're talking about, and what your dad talked about is like the veil of soul making.
Right. Absolutely. So I think the key here is to there's value in the meditative dictum of emptying yourself because we have a lot of noise internally and a lot of imagery internally and a lot of distractions internally. There's nothing wrong with sitting still and closing your eyes and emptying yourself of all that noise and becoming still. That's fine.
Mm,
But the whole point is, why are you doing that? So if that's the end goal, to me, you're missing the other half of the equation, which is you're emptying yourself so that something new can enter. In other words, you are connecting to source, or to, if you want to use, Jungian terms, to the collective unconscious. You're opening yourself up to that imagery that is vast and endless and contains all images of all time, future, past, and present. And so, we do that when we fall asleep because then our ego is, taking a nap, literally. And so
I like that.
that's what we can do consciously as well. So making that practical. I have said tongue in cheek, with all due respect to Beethoven, that Beethoven never wrote any music. He was just a really good listener. And so he knew how to tune in, how to create that empty space, tune in and write down what he heard, which makes a lot of sense that he was deaf because he could hear better and wasn't distracted by the noise around him. I know this might sound like sacrilege to a Beethoven fan, and I have great respect and love Beethoven. It's a metaphor.
Mm,
So the metaphor is that we can empty ourselves and listen and tune in with whatever facilities we like. Some people tune in with images, some people tune in with sound, some people tune in with smells, whatever it takes to tune in to access other realms. And those other realms is where the good stuff comes from. That's where the ideas come from. That's where the images come from. Everything starts as an image. You don't invent the light bulb because it's practical. You have an image of something that makes light that you don't need a candle for instance. And then you try that in all different variations, playing with those images in your mind. That's a creative process. And if you do that by writing down musical scores or poetry or playing with words and editing yourself, and it's a process. Or if you work with wood or with clay or whatever you're doing, it's a way where the body gets to process that emptying of the space. So yes, emptying is good, but allow the other stuff to flow in. Otherwise, you're not in flow. You're closing the door on flow.
mm. Yeah, as you're talking, I got the image of a well, and if the well is full of garbage, then it won't be able to be fed by the underground spring. So
Exactly.
sometimes we got to clear out the garbage from the well and kind of rehabilitate or repair or reclaim the well.
Yeah, and exactly. And I think that, many have said, I'm thinking of Luigi Pericles, the wonderful Swiss artist who was also a metaphysician. He said, we're not the water, we're the pipeline. And that idea is exactly what I'm talking about. So sometimes I think about why it takes energy at all to do a reading, for instance, as an astrologer. And I would imagine it's the same thing if you're writing a poem or writing a song or something. I think it is because the energy that it takes is to keep your own crap out of the pipeline.
Hmm.
because once you put your own crap in, which includes things like criticism, oh, that's no good, or I shouldn't have said that, or why am I making it like this, or that one's much better than I am, or those kinds of things. That's noise, that's crap in the pipeline. That doesn't allow for the thing, for whatever it is, to flow to you and through you and in you. So, we need to create um, practices that work for ourselves. Some people, have their best insights and best downloads, if you want, when they're sitting in the middle of Starbucks with 100 people around, all talking on their phones and laughing and making noise. Other people, sit on a mountaintop. We don't have, there's no, this idea that we have to sit in lotus position and say Om, and then that's the only way we access source is not true. People have very different ways to do that. Some people do it in the shower. Some people do it driving down the road to work. Wherever it is, we get these connections. It's suddenly like the pipeline is open and whoosh, here comes all the stuff. The trick for us as human beings is to find ways to capture that. Luckily today, everybody has a recording device in their pocket. Some even have it on their arm, as a watch. So you can just capture those ideas and then deal with them later when time allows.
Hmm.
But that is the connection to source that is vital for feeling alive. Otherwise, we're just, robots.
Hmm.
Creating stuff based on dictums and programs and not really connecting. But it's that connection that was lost because people used to make that connection through religion. And that gave them that sense of being connected to something larger than themselves.
Hmm.
But it's essentially, as a human being, it's what gives us a reason for existence. And I think, others have talked about the religious gene. I don't like the term, but that idea that there is something in us that needs to feel connected to something larger,
Hmm.
definitely.
Yeah, like what Jung called the religious impulse.
Hmm.
It's in us, and it's probably best to channel that in a creative, expansive way, rather than let it get attached to a kind of a dogma or political belief. All those things that can replace or that can somehow satisfy the religious impulse, but not really get you there to source or to God or to the numinous.
Hmm.
Yeah. We lost David Lynch very recently, and I love his metaphor of what you're talking about with the emptying and connecting to source or the wellspring. His idea of like fishing. You're going fishing, and the ideas are like little fish that you catch.
Hmm.
And it's like there's something in that, like, well, you got to go out to the source, to the lake or the pond, and you got to put your rod in the water and maybe put a little like attractive, tasty bait on it, and you never know what you're going to catch. But it's that practice of like if you don't go out to the pond, you're not going to catch anything. And so, yeah.
Exactly. And if you don't, you have to do the prep work. There's prep work that has to happen to connect to source. And um, people are increasingly looking for that. The whole plant medicine movement is about that, and that's now entering, therapy and trauma work and all kinds of different areas as a way for people to say, my own little world, my own little physical space, and my own little body is just not enough to connect. We're increasingly becoming aware how we are grains of sand on a beach, and that there are other people there, and that, with the whole global connectivity and the universal everything, there is an increased sense that no, I can't go lock myself in a hut in the woods and live my own little life. I'm really part of something much bigger. And however we do that, however we connect, without losing some kind of maybe humanly necessary need for self and identity, we have a strong desire at this point to connect with source. And so it's that sort of balance to me that is the major future dialogue, which is, how do I become connected to source and at the same time stay an individual, um, separate from others, but still know that I am one with others. It's this, so the non-duality went to the other extreme, and it's really a balance of both.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, we've been kind of touching on this theme that I've been thinking about recently. It's Jung's idea of knowing your myth, what myth you're living. And he had the revelation that it was like the task of tasks. He had this realization that he was no longer living in the Christian myth that he was raised in. And so he put it to himself to know his myth, and that sent him on this whole journey that's outlined in the Red Book and beyond. Um, I mean, first of all, what do you think about that? How important do you think that is? And what do you think he meant by finding your myth? Because that could be, maybe construed to be like, well, I'm living the Oedipal myth, or I'm living the myth of Prometheus. But that's like still living someone else's myth in a way, I think. And so the personal myth is different. And I wonder if we could talk about that.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the question slightly differently and talk about archetypes.
Hmm.
Because myths are basically stories that are archetypal to me. So, what do I mean with that? So, I'm going to use a very simple, practical example of what I think about when I think about archetypes. I like chocolate, so let's think of a three-layered chocolate cake. Very, very practical. Top layer is behavior. It's what you do. It's what's measurable. So, when you get angry, your face turns red and your blood pressure goes up. These are measurable things, for instance. So, if we take that example of anger, and somebody recognizes in their behavior that they're always angry, they can make that statement, I'm always angry. Okay, that's a statement of behavior. Many people stay in that level. They never go deeper into the cake. They just stay there. It's all about behavior, behaviorists, and how to change behavior, how to manipulate behavior, and so forth.
And also, I'm angry because my father was
Hold on,
always angry.
that's the next layer.
Okay.
That's the next layer. Now we can ask the question, why am I always angry?
Right.
And go beyond the behavior and ask the question. Now we're in the middle layer. So we can come up with different lenses for that. If we have a psychological lens or a victim lens, we might say, well, I'm angry because my dad hit me when I was small or was always angry and showed me that that's how to be as a man or something like that. Whatever stories we tell ourselves, they are explanations and a particular lens to answer the reason of why I'm angry. Let's use a different lens. Let's use one that's sociological and say, I'm always angry because we live in angry times.
Hmm.
That's a different lens. It doesn't blame anybody. It sort of explains it through the circumstances that I'm in. And so you can recognize your own lenses that you're looking at to explain the why of the behavior. That's a different mindset. A lot of people don't go there, but those who go there have their own lenses and their own perspectives. What my father would have said, they're sitting in their own tree looking at it from that place. We can go deeper. The bottom layer um, of the cake is the archetypal one. And the archetypal one simply recognizes what archetype is present in the behavior. And so, in my language, as an astrologer, I would say the warrior or Mars is very present. It's a martial energy. All the planets have names have words in the English language: mercurial, martial, venal, jovial, which is Jupiterian, those kinds of
Saturnian.
Saturnine, exactly.
Yeah.
And so we can say my Mars is easily activated. That's non-judgmental. It's an observation, and it's an understanding using an archetypal eye to recognize which archetype is present in that particular behavior that I'm describing. Now I can ask a different question. Now that I've recognized what archetype is present easily in me, I can ask the question, is that the best way for me to use my Mars?
Hmm.
And I might say, no, not really. If I go out running or punch a bag or defend somebody who can't defend themselves or stand up for something I believe in and go to a political march, I'm using my Mars in a much better way. So than hurting people or bullying people or screaming at people, which is the more common way of expressing the warrior or Mars, because people are not aware of other options. And so archetypal development is that you understand the archetypes that you like to step into and are comfortable with, and you can describe any behavior archetypally, going down with that if you have an archetypal lens to have. And you skip the sort of the psychological and the why and the this one did this to me and so forth. And you have a direct tool and access to something extraordinarily powerful to change your behavior and to find out why on a much deeper level. Because you can say, I recognize the archetype. Here's how I would like to live that archetype. There are no good or bad archetypes. There are no good or bad planets. There's ways to live all of them that are good and that are bad.
Right, creative or destructive expressions of these
Exactly.
powers.
Yeah, exactly. And we have very, very strong cultural connotations to these. And so, we've done all this work now and research in big organizations where we work. And it's just very common for women to have the least comfortable access to the warrior and for men to the least comfortable access to the lover or to the nurturer. Well, are we surprised? Not really. If you think about how, boys don't cry and girls don't get angry, that's how we're raised. And so, sure, things are changing, but deep inside, a lot of that is still very true and sort of sliding back as we speak also. But these are the recognitions that we can understand where it comes from. Just say, wait a minute, this is not how things have to be. This is culturally shaped, and there's lots of other ways to do it. And how do I want to express so we're staying true to the archetype, but finding new ways to express it. So I'm not
Hmm.
denying that somebody has a strong warrior. I'm finding better ways to use it.
Yeah, you're not trying to get rid of the anger,
Right.
because if you try
Exactly.
to get rid of the anger, you're getting rid of a potential power for them to take
Not only
action in
that,
the
but you're
world. And yeah.
not only that, but it's impossible to get rid of an archetype. People have tried. People who tell me I never get angry scares the shit out of me, frankly.
I know.
Pardon my
I'm
French,
like,
right?
I don't trust those
Because
people.
yeah, exactly. Or who says, "Oh, I'm never falling in love again," or who say these sort of, absolute statements about their archetypes. It's just not possible. You can't deny your lover. You'll fall in love with food or something else.
Hmm.
Love is an archetype. It's universal. Everyone experiences it in some way. So is the warrior. So is the strategist or the Saturnine energy. So is the optimistic, growing, Jupiter energy in all of us. So there are these core 10 astrology gives us these 10 core archetypes that are incredibly powerful. They're like a full set of keys with which you can play any song.
Hmm. Yeah, that's one of the values. My wife's a professional astrologer, and it's one of the values I've come to see in astrology is that it's like one of the most complete systems of archetypal understanding that exist. It's really hard to find like holes in it. It covers a lot of ground, and it's differentiated in a really nice way. Um, to believe in astrology, do you need to kind of have a Neoplatonic belief in that story of how we came to be and how the planets influence us, or is it possible to work with astrology without that?
You'll have to say more of what you mean with belief and with a Neoplatonic belief, because that can mean a lot of different things and might not mean the same thing to me as to you. Do you want me to just answer what I hear, or do you want to elaborate on the question?
Well, I'm thinking about like that idea that, our soul passes through these different spheres, and we take on planetary attributes depending on, how we pass through, and that's how we come in with these characteristics kind of inborn. That's a mythology, that's a story. And
Right.
I'm just wondering, like for me, I like that story a lot.
I like it too. I also think it's too big for many people that I've talked to as an astrologer, where because it also requires the notion of that, many of these traditional stories also have the idea in them of reincarnation, which is very difficult and scary for many people
Hmm.
because they don't believe in it or they don't know what to do with those thoughts. It's too big, it's too much. So I don't think any of that is necessary. I think what's necessary is uh, a reanimation. Reanimation comes from the word anima, which literally means soul. So it's a re-ensouling of the world. That's what's necessary. And that's what we've lost because of technology and the left brain world, and because everything that you can't measure is not. That's what we lost when we turned on the light switch.
Hmm.
Literally, in the age of enlightenment, we turned on the light switch and said, if it's not measurable, if it's not, then it's not real. And that has hurt people tremendously. And so now we're really hungry for reconnecting to that soulful place. There's a huge Jungian movement right now in China because that was taken out culturally,
Hmm.
very much. Don't believe in anything. If it's not measurable, it's not real. And so, you can take the religion out of the country, but you can't take the, I mean, you can take, you know what I'm saying. Basically,
Take the religion of the country, but you can't take the religious impulse out of
out
the
of the
people.
thank you for helping me on that. Exactly. And so people need some kind of a cosmology, a way of understanding and putting, making sense of the world. So, so the so what people need to quote unquote believe in astrology to me is an experience. Because if you sit down and you try to rationally explain it to a left brain person what astrology is, then you're talking Chinese and the other person is talking Russian and they're not going to understand each other. Not a good idea. So to me, there was this guy, Mezirov, who was a professor at Columbia in New York in the 70s, who came up with this idea that for adults to learn anything new, they had to have what he called was a disorienting dilemma.
Hmm.
So here's how I envision that. Say you and I are sitting here, but let's say we're in the same room, so you actually see me fully. And as we're having tea and talking about the meaning of life, I start to levitate. You have two choices, kind of like a Matrix moment with the red pill and the blue pill. You can run out of the room screaming and saying, I don't know what he put in my tea, but I'm never talking to that guy again. This never happened. And if anybody ever asks me, I will deny it.
Hmm.
Or you could say, what the hell just happened? This is really curious to me. And you can start learning because you have no idea what it's a disorienting to your whole worldview that I'm sitting here levitating. So to me, we have to have, as an adult, that's what he sort of taught, that we have to have, now doesn't mean you have to learn how to levitate to be able to be effective in teaching people new things. But it means that unless people have an experience that they can't explain, that they could then become curious about, then their rational mind is going to overrun them all the time and tell them, here's why it doesn't work. If you say you believe in astrology, then you must be stupid. Then you must belong to these kinds of people. I don't want to be one of those kinds of people.
Hmm.
And you go down that whole rabbit hole of pre-programmed thinking that just unravels and takes you nowhere. And then you miss out on a whole lot of beauty. So my suggestion is for someone who is skeptical about astrology is to keep their skepticism. That's perfectly healthy and it's fine. And have an experience. Talk to a good astrologer, call your wife, and have an experience that changes their life because that's what it is. For many people, it's like, they start laughing, like, how did you know? They start crying.
Hmm.
How did you know this? Have you been talking to my spouse? You've heard all of these stories. I've done this for 48 years and I've talked to thousands of people. And yes, I've seen all the skeptics. I talked to psychiatrists and I talked to Oscar winners and I talked to high military men and women and I talked to strippers and I talked to plumbers. I talked to all kinds of people. There's no typical person who gets an astrological reading. It is about people who are curious or have come to the limit of their own belief systems and need to find meaning in the larger context of things. So, if a person has an experience about astrology, and then starts to get curious. Well, how is that even possible? Then they might go into some of the longer things that are certainly worth doing of how it works and why does it work and all the mechanics of it. But you don't have to know the mechanics of it. You don't have to believe in the mechanics of it. That's to me really the point. So just to emphasize that, another metaphor I like to use, imagine two young girls who grew up in a little bitty village in the outbacks of, let's say, China and they've never been out of their village, and somebody invites them to come to Broadway. And they're really excited, and they're sitting in the front row of this massive Broadway show. The one girl is absolutely fascinated by, she doesn't understand a word, but she's fascinated by the ropes and the pulleys, and she can see behind the curtain and how people are pulling levers and pushing buttons, and the lights are moving, and things are moving around the stage, and backdrops are coming up and down, and the costumes are phenomenal and the colors, and she's just thrilled by the whole mechanics of what's going
Hmm.
on. The other girl is trying to figure out what the story is about. They're looking at the same thing. One's the astronomer, the other's the astrologer.
Hmm.
The astronomer wants to know about the mechanics of the planets. The astrologer wants to know what they mean. Nobody's right or wrong, but it's two different perspectives on the same thing. So, if somebody comes to me and tries to explain the meaning of the play by saying, because the six lights were moved to the left, that's why she fell in love with him on the stage. Yeah, no, it's not a mechanistic understanding. It's with a different tool set that we understand meaning, and that is a right brain capability. And so if we come at it from a left brain capacity, we're going to miss out. And if we come at surgery with a right brain capacity, we're also going to miss out and probably cut off the wrong leg. So, there are places for both. And ideally, we come at life with a full brain perspective where we use both at all times. That's, who would want to live with half their brain?
Yeah. So maybe one of the ways to talk about personal myth is that it's distinguished from the details of your personal biography, which is just talking about the events of your life, like the kind of mechanics of your life. Whereas personal myth evokes something of, well, it's a meaningful story. There's some deeper significance here. There's a relationship to the cosmos. I'm not an isolated, atomized individual, just kind of robotically going through life, having sex, eating, you know. Um, would you say that kind of captures that idea of personal myth?
Yeah, I think that's
The story
definitely
with
true.
meaning.
Yeah, story with meaning. It's a, you could even say, using your other example, it's a biography with meaning. Yes, biography matters. Of course it matters. Where I was born and how I was raised and all those things matter. But we can make meaning of them so the myth in the end to me is an image. And the important thing is that that image of what comes up with who we are is not aligned with someone else's. Because as you said, if I say, well, I have an Oedipal complex, so therefore, whatever, that's following, so you're right, someone else's myth. It's the famous line of Campbell, sometimes we climb a ladder all our lives only to get to the top and figure out that it's someone else's ladder. So um, the way I think about that and personal myth is, again, using an image because I love images. Imagine, Brian, if you were the world's greatest lover of puzzles. Nobody loves puzzles as much as you. And I bring you as a gift a big box with a 25,000 piece puzzle, and you get really excited. So you clear off the biggest table you can find. You pour out the box, the contents in the middle of the table. It's a big pile. You go to the box to look what you're going to make here, put together. And on the box, there's no picture, there's no image. There's just a one line of text that says, an image of Brian James. And you're like, okay, that's interesting. Well, what would any puzzle lover do? You would find all the edges and the corners, and that might take you a week. But eventually, you would have a frame on this table that is the frame and the outline of your life. It is sort of the genetics that you came in with. It's the socioeconomic background you came from, all the things that sort of define your life, what frames your life in the most outside sort of way, literally. You can think of it as a birth canal, whatever you want to think of it. It is your outline. And then you remember, oh, there was some purple over here, and oh, there's some purple right here. Put that together, that makes a pretty flower. Then you get bored with that, you go do something else. Eventually, you recognize two things. As the image evolves, the image that is Brian, there are no missing pieces and there are no extra pieces. Some people recognize that image, that is, if you want your personal myth, that story that is shown to you as an image. Some people recognize that image when they're 5 years old and they're crystal clear about it. Some people recognize the image when they put their last puzzle piece in when they're 94. There's no right or wrong. There's no judgment about people recognizing their image, but there are no accidents. There are no mistakes. There's nothing that is missing or that you did wrong. It's just you don't see it, how it fits into the whole puzzle, which explains why after something horrible happens in our lives, we often go back years later and say, oh my gosh, if that hadn't happened, then I wouldn't be, in this great place I am now, or things like that. That's just the silver lining idea. So
Hmm.
so if we think of life like that, then there's curiosity about the image. There's curiosity about what emerges over time and what are the themes, what is the palette, what are the kinds of threads, what are the kinds of stories that are shown in this image. And that starts to make sense. And to me, that exploration is personal development.
Hmm. Hmm. Like what Jung meant by what myth am I living? It's my task to find that.
I think what myth am I living is a little bit different. I think
Hmm.
the myth that I'm living is, what myth implies that there are a certain number of myths. Sure, there are limited amounts of stories. That's like we said, the Beauty and the Beast is a story that's universal, and there's lists of those stories that are that repeat themselves and come up. Rags to Riches is another example, or the hero's
Hmm.
journey is another example that exist all over the place. I don't think I would disagree with Jung on that one. I don't think that it's what myth in the sense of someone else's myth, and myth are often like that. But to me, it's about what image am I am I living, and how am I? And yeah, we can ask the question, how does that image fit into the collective? That's an interesting question as well.
Hmm.
But on the personal front, you're talking about personal development and my personal story and my personal myth. It is about coming to grips with what the image is that emerges in that puzzle piece to me. And
Hmm.
other people, are part of that. Relationships are part of that. Everything that happens in my life is part of that puzzle piece. There's no extra, no missing pieces. So, so I think of myth as my myth as coming to terms. And the older we get, the clearer the image gets. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, we start to get a sense of who we are, because that's the puzzle, right? That's
Hmm.
the coming to terms of who we are. And 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 we can have retrospection, and we can look back, and we can see, and we can look at more of the puzzle because we've laid more pieces. That all makes sense to me. My personal myth is a bit too heroic for me, and it goes a little bit into that whole hero's journey thing, which I'm not a big fan of, because the problem with the hero's journey, sort of in the call to action and these kinds of things, is that it's all about me, and it leaves out the collective. And so you're in my way, but I'm on my hero's journey, then I have a right to just, remove you or walk past you. And that to me is the problem with that model. It doesn't fit the Aquarian age, where the collective is just as important as the individual.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess I read it, a little differently. I think Jung was still discovering what his myth is, even up until his death. You see his last writings, and he's still getting these different perspectives, looking back on it all, and kind of living these questions through his life. So I think about it as like paying attention to the story as it unfolds, and like you were saying before, kind of co-creating it, being a player in that story. And I like, in your work uh, with the archetypes, you use this metaphor of the stage of a play, and who are the archetypes are like characters on the stage, and who are the kind of the lead characters, who are the bit players, who are the ones waiting off in the wings for their chance to be in the spotlight. And I really like that metaphor because it brings in that element of play and a story unfolding over time, and not just being a spectator to the story, or not being a kind of what the kids today call an NPC, a non-player character, just like a robotic, I'm just going along with it. But being kind of like in that, yeah, improvisatory director role, co-creating. I like that.
Yeah, and you can do a lot with that image. So for instance, if you go to meetings all day long at work and nobody ever listens to you, and everybody, shouts over you and ignores your ideas, then from my perspective, your warrior is probably not even on your stage, but maybe in the green room taking a nap, right? Because you don't
I
know how to
was
just
gonna say
you
he's
don't you
asleep.
yeah, you don't know how to
He's
defend
checked
yourself.
out.
So, right, exactly. And so what the archetypal model tells you, which is very different from the whole idea of, for instance, strength finders that talks about gifts and basically implies weaknesses and things like that, is that, hey, you've got a warrior. She's just asleep. So what are you going to do to awaken that part of yourself? It's very different to saying, here's who you are. You're this
Hmm.
type. I'm an INTFJ or whatever the Myers-Briggs model says. And then, which I'm not, by the way, but somebody says, this is what I am. And I've been to plenty of Jung parties where they all talk like that. I'm
Yeah.
in this. Oh, that's so funny that I can even talk to you considering I'm in, this. It's idiotic. It's typology, which is really the opposite of what Jung would have wanted. He
Yeah, it's
doesn't
so
want, yet.
reductive. Yeah.
Yes, he's reductive. Of course, he developed, a typology, and I get it, but we've come a long way from that. We have to remember about Jung that Jung was incredibly advanced for his time and really a pioneer in so many ways. But we've also moved on from him. And Jung, to me, the biggest problem I have with the with Jungian dogmatics is that they're dogmatic, and so they,
They're
if Jung
stuck.
didn't say,
Hmm.
yeah, they're stuck. So if Jung didn't say it, didn't do it. So we can go further. And I know I'm also fighting my father's fight here of archetypal psychology taking, Jungian psychology to a new place. And I think we're doing the same with archetypal astrology. We're taking it to a new place, even further beyond archetypal psychology. So
Hmm.
it's about, you know, things have to adapt and change. It doesn't make a lot of sense, some of the rules from the Bible. If you take them literally, it's kind of idiotic these days. And so a lot of people are saying, well, that's not for me because I can't relate to that anymore because things have changed so much,
Hmm.
or whatever other reasons. And so ideas have to evolve, ideas have to change, ideas have to grow, and we have to bring in contemporary. Again, this is what co-creating with the moment is about. So when the times change, the
Hmm.
zeitgeist is different, then my response to the zeitgeist has to be appropriate and not coming from the 1950s when we are now in the 2020s.
Hmm.
So that's a different, that's a skill set that I think Jungians, many are embracing and are learning and are taking it further and going past that. So I think some of the notions and again, imagine that Jung's having a personal experience of something, which he then makes interpretations about when his own descent and the Red Book and all of that. But we have now, another, what is it, 50, 60, 70 years of experience after that that we can add to from other perspectives and say, it's almost like we can give him the input that he didn't have the zeitgeist to have, to give it, to make it even more valuable, which doesn't devalue what he experienced
Hmm.
or wrote, but we can add to it. And
Yeah.
so,
It's not a
and even his,
negation, it's an additive. Yeah, and a
right,
development.
otherwise it becomes a cult, and I'm not
Yeah.
interested in that. So
Yeah.
it's like, what are the seeds? What are the gifts that we can take from Jung's work, and then how can we take it further without being afraid that we're not honoring the master? That's just not. That's not. I don't think Jung would have wanted that.
No, and I mean his ideas developed over his lifetime. Like this whole thing about
Exactly.
typology being so rigid, that was early on. That was early days. And I think, when he talked about the cultural myth needing to be constantly renewed and updated to reflect the time, the zeitgeist, you have to apply that also to the myth of Jungian psychology, and it needs to keep
Absolutely.
getting updated. Like, and I think
Right.
that's one of the things I greatly appreciate about your dad was that he knew the postmodernists. He was a kind of a natural deconstructionist. He's a child of Mars, and so he was really good at deconstructing. And I think like we're at the stage now after some of that deconstruction that we can start to put some pieces back together in a new way, but the deconstruction had to happen for a kind of a renewal of, let's just say, archetypal psychology, this kind of approach, which itself reclaims things from way back, which I really like too. It's very holistic and integrated with time and our evolution as a culture, as a species. It doesn't leave anything out optimally, I think when it's done well.
Yeah, and that actually that ties us right back into your first question to me, which was about growing up with my father. And yeah, my father was, extraordinarily martial in the sense that he was, a destroyer, and I saw him, question people on everything. Why do you think you need to be happy? I heard him say to a friend once, it's like, like he's
It's
like, oh, any
wilting.
any assumption, any assumption you have, he would challenge it because he thought it was valuable, and I believe he's right, that it's valuable to challenge our all of our belief systems at all times and ask ourselves, why do we believe that? Is that really what we want and what we want to believe? However, there's a missing piece. And so I've also, which is, and then what do you do with the deconstructed, broken down
Yeah,
everything?
you're in rubble and you're
And
like,
that,
what do I do
right.
with this? There's
And
nowhere to
that,
stand.
and he also was well known for being on the stage in front of hundreds of people and saying, and someone said, well, what are your ideas about that? How do we fix that? Or whatever. He said, that's not my job. He said, it's not my job to create or to fix or to give you how-tos or to give you models of how to fix things. My job is to question. So it's a very Aries, double Aries kind of a model, like horns down to to deconstruct, as you put it. Others might call it destroy, but it's deconstruct. Okay, let's use that term. So father was a double Aries, very strong Arian sort of Aries type. I'm a, quadruple Capricorn, very, very strong Capricorn type. So the horns kind of clash. It's different. But I'm also a builder. So the way I've often compared us, and I think it's even in the book that Dick wrote from one of my interviews with him, was that my father would, if you built a sandcastle, my father would kick it down and I would rebuild it.
Mhm.
I'm a builder. I have a degree in architecture. I'm a builder. I think I make things with my hands. And so I've also constructed all these models and these how-tos on how to use all this abstract, wonderful material that has no hands and feet unless you have a puzzle metaphor or something you can actually do to think about it. Otherwise, they're just great ideas, but people got mad at him and threw his books in the corner because
Yeah.
there are no, and then went and picked them up again because there are no how-tos. So we've created a lot of how-tos in our models that build on archetypal, but that's the next step to me. It's taking the deconstruction and saying, now that we've deconstructed everything, how are we, and we've questioned everything, how do we actually make something that's useful and practical and applicable that people can learn and use on a daily basis? That to me is really important. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of the biggest distinction between going from Jung through my dad to me.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, I found like in the early days encountering your dad's work and having it kind of work on me, I had a lot of resistance to models and systems. But over time, starting to work with people around some of these ideas and concepts, I realized just how valuable it was to have a model or a map to at least use as a starting point to orient yourself, to kind of get the lay of the land, but always understanding that the map or the model is not the territory. So use it as a tool, use it as a lens, use it as a frame. Um, yeah, but it's so helpful because yeah, one of the biggest criticisms of your dad was like, well, how do we apply this to our actual psych? I got to go to work tomorrow and see clients. Now I feel like I'm just in the rubble, and I don't feel like it's a good thing to bring any kind of concept or model in. But these people need help at the end of the day. They want to
Exactly.
understand their lives.
Right. And he always said that's not my job. And so,
Right.
I took that as a call to, figure out models. Certainly I heard him on that. And it's my nature to create models. But you're very right about the model not being the landscape or the territory or the map. That is really the key. And and there we can go back to Hillman, to my dad, and really listen to this thing about not being so literal,
Mhm.
because if we think, well, the answer is in the model, no, it's not. The model is a scaffolding through which you then build your own truth or your own reality or your own story for the client or whatever you need. But the scaffolding isn't the building, it holds things together.
Mhm.
It's a model that does that, and it is limited in its own set, and it is a perspective, and it is not the truth. The model does not contain the truth, but it is a tool. Just because you have fabulous tools doesn't mean you're going to build a nice house.
Mhm.
And so it's up to you to learn how to use the tools well to then, work with your own imagination to create the house. That's still your job. But, it's hard to build a house without any tools at all, which is was kind of his way. Like you say, go to work and help someone who's in a crisis. So we want to have practical things to do. Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate how much work that you've put into that, building out some more nuanced models. Like there's the work that Robert Moore did with the four primary archetypes of the male psyche, king, warrior, magician, lover, and I still use that model. I think it's really great. But it's only good if you allow yourself to go into the nuances, which then you've done, taking like the astrological model and applying it to like archetypal psychology or practical in work situations. So now we're dealing with 10, and there's like a little more nuance there, which I appreciate. Like, how far do you think we should go with differentiation until it just becomes like too many pieces of the puzzle?
Yeah, so that's a really good question that we've been dealing with in our model, working now in organizations for a while, and sort of in the real practical world and with individuals in personal development. So My partner Richard Olivier had the same experience with. He also worked with Moors, and you mentioned a little word in there. You slipped in there, which was, male psyche,
Mm,
and so that's half the population, and so that's another part of the problem of Moors, and it came out of and the whole men's movement thing and all of that had its own importance and place and time, but we moved on to that. So Richard came to the same place. He was using it in his leadership development organization, Olivia Mythodrama in London, and he just found that there's not enough subtlety here, so he wanted more, and he found this tremendous greater access to a person's inner life by using the 10 archetypes that are in archetypal astrology, the 10 planets. So we then created, this new model together based on that, basically translating the archetypal astrological work into business speak. How do you do that so it actually makes sense? So that means you take words like death and sex and these kinds of things go away because you're not talking about those in a business setting. You respect the the your hosts,
the
when you go,
context, yeah. Hmm.
yeah, the context. And so we've created now a model. We've translated it, into 13 languages. We're talking with a lot of people around the world, and we found that these are very useful and they're the right amount. I think 10 is a really good amount. We can handle it. It's based on first on five. We have five realms. In other words, to do leadership or to be a functioning person, you need some order in your life,
Hmm.
some order. Then you need some relationships, which is another piece of those five. The second piece you need some creativity. You need to handle change, and you need to take action, do something about all the smart stuff you just learned, get
Hmm.
off your butt. So those five things are at the core of many, many, many leadership models that have been out there for a long time. And so we used the notion of five because we realized people can handle sort of five things. Yeah, they can do that because you can get into hundreds of, there's endless archetypes. How do you
Hmm.
make, a system that works? And then from there, we recognize that two of the planets or two of the archetypes very easily fit those five um, realms. And that became the model. And then we have the 10 like that. And so, in the realm of order, for instance, we have the sovereign, which generates from a central place outwards in a generative sort of spirit, the sun in astrology. And then you have Saturn, the structure, which is more an internal, introverted sort of way of making order and organizing and keeping things focused. So you do that for all five, you get these 10 archetypes of the archetypes at work model. And they're very handy, very practical. Is that enough? Is that the right number? I think it's enough, and I think it's the right number, and I think it's been proven to be that. You could expand, you could add other archetypes, not necessary. And another reason that it works so well, I think, is because it's based on astrology, which is, the oldest
Hmm.
science out there, if you want to use that word. That's
Yeah,
been done for
it's been
5,000 years. So we have a
time
lot of data.
tested and
We have a
yeah.
lot of data about astrology and about the planets and what they represent. So the archetypal language of the planets is really in a good foundation. You can come up with your own archetypes and use ones that we don't use, like the orphan or these kinds of things, the good king or, others. But um, I can easily give you equivalents of those archetypes in our model. So think of it this way. Think of it with the 12 keys on the piano, the five black keys and the seven white keys of one octave. You can play any song. You might change octaves, but it's still the same key. It's the same note.
Well, you could play any Western song.
I was just going to say, you can play any Western song for our world. That's correct. Like
Yeah,
it's not
no
atonal.
microtones on the piano.
I
Yeah.
was just going to say that. Thank you. So, but with that, you can, and yes, of course, everybody's going to come from the place that we are. But what we notice with the planets, because everyone is born under the same planets, those 10 are actually universal. And
Yeah.
so you can play any macrotone on those. And so it's actually a better analogy than the piano. With the piano, it's for the Western mind, it is yes. And of course, when we use the names of the gods that we have, when we call Venus Venus, which is a Western idea, and a Western goddess, then we are showing what culture we're coming from or what part of the world we're coming from. But that archetype exists in every culture. And
Mm,
so it's just that I'm going to speak from the reference that I know. I'm not going to do culture appropriation about stuff I don't really know about. I'm going to speak from what I know. But if I'm speaking about archetypes at the bottom layer of the cake, doesn't matter where you go in the world. We've proven that now, and we have worked with yam farmers in Africa and leaders in Vietnam and in Sri Lanka and wherever you go, people understand with very different backgrounds, understand this archetypal model because they understand because they're also born, if you want, under the same sky. So that makes sense to me. And so actually having 10 is the perfect number, I think, to do the work at this time. It's not too many, it's not too few, it's not the four that are not enough or that are maybe too masculine. It's 10 that are universal, and it's also not the 12 that can become too complex.
hmm. Yeah, it's great. And I mean, like five is one of those numbers that is a prominent number in many traditions. Like, I've practiced and studied a lot of yoga, and five is always like the model. It's like the five panchas, the five koshas, the sheaths of the body or the person. It's like related, I think, because we have five fingers and we can count on one hand those five. And then with 10, well, a lot of us have two hands or maybe 2 feet, with five toes each. So I like it.
Right.
It fits.
Right, and there's the whole numerology of it too, and the metaphysics of it too, and you can get quite esoteric with it and look at things like the pyramid that has, 5 points on it. And the fifth point is called the quintessential point or quintessence, the whole notion of the spiritual versus the grounded. So there's a lot of mystery in the number five, but we did it for very practical reasons because that's what people already recognize, and we were going out into the field talking about this weird stuff called archetypes to people who had no idea or no inclination,
Yeah.
who left that stuff at the door. If they had any interest in this kind of work, they would leave it at the door when they went to work because at work, we're rational, we're left-brained, and we know. So we have found people who are open enough and
Mm.
ready enough to do this work, and many are never going to be open enough to it and not interested. But to me, they are also not interesting because they're not recognizing a tool that they could be using that could be quite helpful. So
Yeah, they're the
they have to,
two-layer cake people.
yeah.
And I like the I like the metaphor of the cake, the three-layer cake, because when we have that archetypal perspective or sensibility, it adds richness and depth to life, just like that deep three-layer cake that's full of
Exactly. And
richness.
and by the way, most of the business people that I've talked to who aren't on board with this work are one-layer cake people. They're not two-layer cake. They don't ask why. They just know this is the behavior and here's how you manipulate it. You make people buy more by doing this. You do this. They don't ask why. Why do people buy more if I scare them? Um, that's a given. It's just part of the behavior. You scare people more so they buy more, for instance, is a doctrine. So if you know that, that's a behavior thing you know about. You don't have to question it. So a lot of people live on a one cake layer level.
Hmm.
It's where all the sugar is,
Yeah, the
the
quick
icing,
fix. Yeah,
the quick fix, right?
Um, and I guess like, yeah, it does require already a sense of like openness and curiosity about the deeper layers of like the story that's unraveling in our business or in our life. So that's like a prerequisite. It doesn't sound like you're really interested in converting anyone or convincing anyone that there's like a biological basis for the archetypes. And if that helps
Uh,
convince you,
on the contrary, life's way too short. I used to get into those kinds of conversations. I no longer do. I have a sort of a rule of thumb that if I go to a party with 10 people, eight of them will have absolutely no interest in any of this. And they'll just say this is a bunch of baloney and you can't measure it, so it's not real and walk away. One of them will already get it. They don't need, my thoughts or advice or help. And one of them is curious enough or in dire straits enough, or suffering enough, or confused enough, or lost enough that they might be open to something that's a little different to what they know. And they're the ones who I'm interested in talking to. If that's 10% of the business population or the personal development population, whatever else, there's enough work there for people who are interested in these things, for a lifetime or 20, 100 lifetimes.
yeah.
So the work is out there, but we have to find the people who are curious and who have the openness and are willing to take a risk because it's a risk, you know. For some people think you've joined a cult when you get interested in astrology, or you're just naive, or you're just
Or
stupid,
you,
or you're just
or yeah, not a serious person, or yeah.
exactly
Yeah, well, they should talk to my wife. She's very learned and much like you. She's a Capricorn, and so she's very into the study and having that the depth of knowledge and all that. She's like constantly learning, and she's in her 50s, been doing it for a long time too. And so it's kind of like what was that was that Heraclitus who talked about the depths of the soul being so unfathomable that, a thousand lifetimes you could not discover the end of it. And
exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
I did
And
talk to someone recently, like a business guy, a tech business guy, and he was interested in the idea of archetypes. And it was hard to kind of like for him to just like accept that they're a part of us. And so I was trying to figure out like what would help him understand it. And so I related it to like the inborn instincts that we all have, that we all inherit, and that are universal. Like, if a mother's child is being attacked by a wild animal, she's gonna like she's gonna something in her is gonna rise up, and this kind of like strength and ferocity, like the mama bear energy, is gonna take over. I said, that's the archetype. So it's like inborn in the instincts. He's like, okay, so it's in the brain. Well, no, it's not that simple, but you can see how it's in us, right? Or like how a newborn babe knows how to climb up the mother's belly to get to the breast to feed. That's part of the mother-child archetype. It's in us. Or like how a bird knows how to make a nest without going to school for nest building. And so I think, if we talk about instincts and things like that, then I think people can start to, okay, yeah, I can see that, or I get a sense of that.
yeah, and you could add, I think that's a lovely metaphor, and you could just add the word universal instincts, that they are, it
Mhm.
doesn't matter where you go in the world, because that was Jung's great discovery when he traveled around and he found so many things are similar, is that archetypes are also therefore in a time of great separation between people,
Mhm.
and you're with me or you're against me. Archetypes are a unifying language. And that's one of the reasons organizations like to work with it, because,
Mm.
when they have different cultures where people have different, they're just, the culture thing is a middle level thing, it's a middle cake thing. And so you get beyond that, and it alleviates a lot of tension and problems and struggles, just recognizing, well, they do the warrior differently than we do. And so, in that culture, or that person does the lover differently than I do. And so I can be respectful and interested in differences, recognizing what we actually have in common. And so, yes, so I would say it's instincts that are, universal instincts, or behavior patterns, or abilities, or gifts, whatever you want to call them.
Mhm.
But the nest building is a great one, because that's a gift. It's not something bad, for instance. And you could say, what do you think you already knew coming in? That's a way for people to start reflecting on their archetypes. What did you know when you came here that you have applied in your life? What were you sure about? And some things we don't have control over, like falling in love, or getting furious, or having a dream, that we can't control. And so our ego gets bruised, because our ego doesn't like archetypes, because ego likes to think it's in charge.
Right,
That's
that
why,
it's the sole player on the stage and the spotlight's
yeah.
on it, and it's also the director and everything
Right.
else, right?
Another way to introduce the conversation that I found is useful is to talk about inner multiplicity.
Mhm.
All psychologies that you learn about at classic university are developmental, basically, in their model. They have other, behaviors and these kinds of things,
Yeah.
but they're all developmental. First you crawl, then you sit, then you walk, then you run. That's the idea. That's how you develop as a human being. You become better at things. You develop skills and things like that. And the problem with the developmental model, every one that I've ever looked at, is singular in its entity. In other words, it's an I that is developing. Who is developing
Mhm.
here? It's me. Me. Laurence Hillman is developing, right? First I sat, then all of that. Okay. That's not how we actually experience ourselves. We
Yeah.
have conversations with ourselves all the time. Should I do this? Should I do that? Should I give her the boot? Should I stay with her? Should I, we have these conversations all day
Yeah.
long.
Where a voice comes and says, "Don't do that." Like it's
Exactly,
talking to the
exactly.
I. It's like, whoa,
Exactly.
okay.
And you know what the fastest growing psychology is today, from what I've
IFS,
understood?
parts work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. IFS, internal family systems, parts work, because that's a recognition of inner multiplicity. That's really the way we experience ourselves in the developmental model of the singular I.
Everybody gets it. They go, yeah, part of
Right.
me wants this, part of me wants
Exactly.
that. Oh, there's a
Exactly.
conflict here. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, what we can do with astrology, which is the cool thing that immediately makes sense in that context, is we can actually map out those parts and look at that. We can put them all these parts on a stage and we can start to tell the story of the play. Who's kissing whom, who's slapping whom, who's stabbing whom, what's that inner drama that's going on?
Hmm.
And if I have that as a story, then my personal myth or my personal story becomes really clear to me. And once I get it, then I can have a lot of fun with it and I can play with it and I can understand it without having to be critical. Remember, at the archetypal level, we don't prejudge. We don't say this is good or this is bad. We just say this is what is. And now how am I taking it up through the cake? That's where it becomes good or bad. So I'm not being naive
Yeah.
about Pluto being all happy and loving. I'm saying that Pluto is an energy, and what I do with it, it's nothing until activated, which is where the other two layers come in.
Right.
But we have a
It's
tool to be able to
potential.
read, right? We have a tool to read and even map out the the archetypal story in a person. That's an extraordinary tool.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the limitations of IFS that kind of irks me because it is getting really popular and I hear people taking on the language is it never gets to the archetypal ground for these different parts. It never goes to that third layer or the rhizomic layer that Jung talked about, the understory, which is so rich and brings in that element of the universality. And so I wish that IFS people would like just go to archetypal astrology. It's all there, but it's so much more rich and diverse and
They're trapped in a mindset
the
that
system.
in a system, and they're also
Yeah.
trapped in literalism, and they're also trapped in some
Yes.
words that I don't like personally, like good and bad and things like that. And there's some judgmental
Protector,
words in it.
prosecutor, there's
Yeah,
moral
exactly.
judgment there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Those are not terms that I ever use because archetypes are per se nothing until they are activated, and I mean good or bad in that sense.
It's
And
how
so
we express them. So like the
yeah,
warrior can protect and or destroy.
exactly. And defend or challenge, as we put it in
Hmm.
our model. So this is it. Yeah, so it's halfway there, but what I'm glad about is that at least it's bringing up multiplicity, and that
Yes,
people are
right.
talking about inner multiplicity, so they're getting there, and that's going to be easier for people from there to add the next layer of archetypes, which is going to the deepest layer. But the thing that archetypal astrology does is that it makes archetypal psychology practical. It makes it
Yes.
useful. It gives you the
Yeah.
how-tos and the tools to actually map out this stuff that is otherwise so vague. We have an archetypal assessment that is the first way that a lot of people come to terms with their inner archetypes or with archetypal thinking. And I didn't really want to do it because I didn't really want to quantify archetypes because I didn't
Hmm.
think you could. But I ended up doing it. It was possible. So during COVID, I wrote this assessment with help from people who know much more about assessments than I did. And I call it an assessment, it's not a test. And I very carefully and purposefully use the word preferences. So we call it the Archetypal Preferences Report. It's just a report. It's not a judgment. It's not a test. You didn't fail or win it.
It's not written in
And
stone.
it's not written so exactly. And the archetypal preferences report says, right now, how does your stage look? Who's in the spotlight? Who are your favorite actors, and who's not so much? Who's in the green room taking a nap? And then you can ask questions. When I've debriefed people all around the world now on this, leaders of all kinds, and it's fascinating because it opens up these fabulous conversations. What is it costing me that my warrior is in the green room taking a nap?
Hmm.
Nobody listens to me in meetings. Okay, so how do I activate my warrior? Now we have a development plan. So this is so useful and so practical and so simple, and we can say, well, I'm really happy with my sovereign. I think I'm the boss of everything, and I'm in the center of my own little pigsty here. I'm the king. If that's my attitude, then what does that cost me? And nobody respects me because I'm just taking that role without having earned it, for instance, or I was crowned because I inherited the business, or something like that. There's all
Yeah.
these. You can make the story so practical,
Hmm.
and it allows for development if people are willing to look at themselves through those lenses. And so we teach people how to work with this report and how to get trained on a debrief, on how to work with somebody when they get their 26-page report out on what this all means and how it could all look, and how to work with someone then to do some coaching with them to get them more conscious of these different parts. So that's
Yeah.
very practical.
Archetype,
Definitely.
I call it archetypal attunement.
Exactly.
Um, and what I found and why I love the archetypal model is that it really immediately engages people in their story. Like when we're working in a kind of archetypal mode, we get so excited. Like the person that I'm working with all of a sudden is like really interested in how all these dynamics are playing out in their life because it's dramatized, it's personified, it's not some abstract idea of anger, but all of a sudden there's a warrior and like what's what's my style of warrior? What are the movies where I see this character that I'm really attracted to, like an Aragorn in Lord of the Rings? I go, God, that Viggo Mortensen, that's some good warrior energy there. I'd love to have
Mhm.
some more of that. So it's
Right. How do I
immediately
get
kind
it?
of engaging, and people are I already think psychologically without any psychological jargon necessary, which I really think is useful.
Yes, and they see themselves in the story, which is
Yeah.
really, really powerful because when we're good at what we do, we can give people metaphors that are really easy to understand and we can meet them where they are and not come up with big, complex, you don't have to have the chart in front of you. You don't have to see. I never give my clients the chart to look at. It's just confusing. It's a
Mhm.
bunch of details. I send it afterwards if they want to look at it. But it's, let's be in the story and in the moment and not in the description of it, or in the image.
Don't get caught up on the scaffolding. Pay
Exactly.
attention to the Mies van der Rohe that
Thank
is
you.
behind
Thank you.
it.
Thank you. Very, very, very good point. But there's recognition. So hold on, sorry.
One of the things that I wanted to return to is something that you started to touch on earlier, but one of the real benefits of having an archetypal perspective, well, one of the many benefits I think is like first of all, being able to kind of disidentify with these parts or these characters who are playing out in our psyche, in our life. Um, so like not identifying with the anger, but recognizing, well, there's Mars in me, and Mars is really active, and maybe my Mars is being like not channeled in a creative direction, and so I can work with Mars. And so there's a disidentification there, which I think is really helpful and resonates with what I experienced through my yoga practice and what the yoga philosophy is telling us is like the cause of our afflictions is this over-identify over-identification with the self. And so archetypal psychology, that archetypal view helps us to find that separation and then recognize, well, actually, there are all of these potentials and the gods are within us and they're all trying to have a say. And so can the I in me be a kind of like I don't know, maybe a director, but the right kind of director, one who's not like so authoritative and oppressive, but it's like kind of like helping things to play out in a good way. Um, Something like
So
that. But then I also think like from a cultural level, like how we respond to what's going on in culture, when I look at what's happening and I'm seeing it with an archetypal lens, I'm seeing like the deeper layers and I'm not getting so caught up in the political fighting and division, but it's actually making me more curious about like what's going on here, like what's actually playing out here, like what's the understory of what I'm being fed on the news or social media. And again, that's like a kind of a distancing, like I'm engaged, but I'm not caught up in it. And I see that as really helpful, especially in these times.
yes, my father had a question that he would ask all the time that's deeply ingrained in my brain that I teach my students that I think is the key question for everything, and that is simply asking the question, who is here?
Hmm.
Who is here? Meaning what archetype is present in this situation? So if somebody's standing in front of me yelling at me, then I'm looking at a warrior, I'm looking at a Mars energy. So who is here also implies a multiplicity. Not the person is not Mars. The person is embodying Mars, a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's the recognition of the inner multiplicity. And so then I can be challenged to say, how do I turn that Mars into maybe a storyteller, Mercury, so that we can have a conversation as opposed to screaming. So how would I activate that storyteller in the person? So that would be a nice challenge instead of saying I was going to scream back and now we're just fighting. So these kinds of things. But the real learning there, which is what you're talking about, I believe, is that we have choice how we express these archetypes. We're not victims to them. We're not, again, back to the how do I live my life? You have a choice on how you live them. It fits right into the model of co-creating. First, you
Hmm.
can use the archetypes to know what's going on in life, and then you can also figure out which of the archetypes in you would be the most useful to co-create with what's going on at this time. So if we live in warring times, it might be a good time to get into your warrior and go and demonstrate or something like that. So it's
Yeah.
there are different ways of it's a conscious way of living and of how you step into your archetypes. So the question of of who's here leads us to a different way of asking the question of how then when once we know who's here, how do we then want to express that part? So an image that I sometimes use is easy to imagine. Imagine two hands, black background, just two hands in front of that black background. One of them is holding a street, a sort of a switchblade for a street fight, and the other one is holding a scalpel. Both of those, a surgical scalpel, both of those are Mars.
Hmm.
Anybody who has got an archetypally trained eye immediately recognizes Mars in those two instruments, in those two hands. And then my question to my student or to my audience is, how are you using Mars?
Hmm.
Both true. They're both Mars, but it's a big difference if you use a switchblade to stab someone or if you use a scalpel to heal someone. So, but they're both Mars. So that's where we have free will in how we express them. We don't have free will if Mars is really active right now, or if we have a strong Mars in our birth chart, then Mars is important. Then we really need to find a place to put that scalpel, or we need to find a place to become, a runner or something like that to give that energy an outlet.
Hmm.
If we don't, we just become mad and angry.
We've been talking a lot about Mars today. I don't know what's going on. Actually, I told my wife yesterday, I said, keep your Mars out of my Jupiter because we were in kind of two different modes.
That's funny. That's a
Um,
funny, yeah. And those kinds of conversations, lead to humor. And I see those kinds of conversations
yeah.
happening in organizations now. They don't use planet words, but they use archetype words like, keep your warrior out of my explorer, same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lovely. It's quite lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. Helpful in relationship if you're both speaking that kind of language and can kind of step back from, the I don't know, like I keep coming back to like the over-identification with the energy that's there, or but there's like a bit of a stepping back and seeing what's playing out. I don't know.
The ego gets put to rest. I'm not even sure that I believe in the whole idea of the ego, what you call the director or the uber thinker in this whole play or why do we need to have that? That's a fantasy. That's a myth itself. Maybe it's just one of the 10 that's always talking because it's
Yeah.
sometimes it's combinations of them that come up with a voice together like they're singing in harmony. But why do we need the idea that somebody's directing it all? Maybe it's just naturally doing its thing.
Yeah, I think that's why I'm
Um,
getting tripped up on the language because I'm not sure I believe in the singular, ego or the unchanging observer or anything like that. It's not my experience, and
right.
I don't think
The
that's
higher
something I should
self
try to
notice looking
find.
down.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Some call it, the higher self, these kinds of notions. Why do we need any of that? It's just really
I,
quite basic. This is 10,
I know,
this is
but
10
once you start,
figures.
like, again, like, ask that kind of question, like, what it, like, your dad would say, like, what is an ego? I've never seen an ego or a self,
Exactly. Exactly.
and me neither. And sometimes people ask me, like, especially like men who like kind of like need to know the why, like, what's the goal of this work, this archetypal work? Is it so I'm like fully integrated and all these are like fully developed and everything? And the way I put it is, well, like a lot of people go through life being like a kind of one-sided type person. And I want to be like, just personally, I want to be a multifaceted person who's able to respond to the situations in life in a variety of ways that, some are more appropriate than others. And I want that kind of like flexibility and multiplicity in myself. So that's for me what it adds to my life is that it helps me to differentiate the different parts, to relate to them in a different way. Not everything so personalized. Um, and I like that. It's like the idea from the Hindu tradition of like Leela. It's a play, and we're all players on the stage, and like the archetypes show up with different costumes depending on the time and the place. But underneath, it's still that same. that same actor with its kind of like its gifts and its shadow side and all of that.
Love it. Lovely metaphor. And, I, as an Uber Capricorn, do have an answer to that question that's very practical about what is the goal here. And
Okay.
the goal here is very simply to have conscious access to all 10 at any time
Yeah.
to meet a situation the most appropriately.
Yeah.
And to know, and to that means you have to recognize what's going on. That means you have to be tuned into your own expression of these 10, which takes development and time. Not
Hmm.
so easy. And we usually have, some people have lots of those actors sleeping in the green room. They have very little access to them.
Mm.
And so the work is to become comfortable and to develop them one at a time, but to know that they all 10 need to be fully accessible at any given time and to know what tree you're sitting in at any moment, who's here.
Hmm.
And you recognize, and that's also that allows for self-regulation of your own emotions, which is, a really nice thing to have. A lot of people have lost that ability or
Hmm.
never had it.
Yeah. Just
So yeah.
to, with your like theater metaphor and, maybe the warriors in the green room having a nap, I think like, in today's age, what's going on in the zeitgeist, maybe like even the warrior has been canceled and is like barred from the theater because the warrior's problematic.
Yeah, no, you can't ban an archetype. You can try. You can say that we don't like an archetype. So you
Hmm.
can say, when we're in the business world, we don't like to talk about the lover,
Hmm.
because that'll lead to, office romances which are inappropriate. I mean, that's the literalization, not recognizing that the marketing department, that's all they do is talk about lover and get to seduce you to buy stuff you don't need. I mean, that's what marketing is about. It's the
Well,
lover, the
until
lover.
marketing got like worked in marketing, until marketing got taken over by all the magicians who are just thinking about numbers and impressions and
Right.
algorithms. And then that's one of the things that started to suck the life out of marketing for me, is it became all about numbers and
Yeah,
algorithms.
right.
Like,
But
ugh,
my point, you're
where's the
absolutely right.
romance?
Right.
Where's the
You missed the
eros?
room. Right, exactly. You missed the arrows. But what happens is that these energies, the recognition is that the lover is fully present the in any business, even if that sounds like a weird statement to make. And what happens is that when it's not conscious, it often comes out as, as being completely too much, like trying to force to seduce you to like something that you don't really need, selling you crap that's cheap quality, which is, too much negative lover, or there's not enough lover. And so everybody, everybody is stale and robotic and doesn't talk to each other, and there's no interactions, there's no social life within the company. These are real problems. And so so if you walk in with the assumption that all 10 are there and you start to look for where are they
Mm,
in an organization or in a team or in a group of people or in your family, wherever you want, or in your relationship, in yourself, then in your kids, then you start to see that there's a price that we pay for having no access or difficult access to any one of them. That's why astrologers stay in business, because people have problems because they don't know how to express those parts of themselves, or they get into trouble because they overplay them or underplay them. We can overplay and underplay any archetype, which gets us into shadow stuff. So
mhm.
so they're present, they just may not be consciously present. And so the warrior isn't gone. The warrior is incredibly, I mean, I think what's happening in Washington right now is incredibly warrior. It's incredibly aggressive. It's
Mm.
incredibly in your face. It's incredible when people are on the street about it. And it's incredibly, that is raw warrior energy, not kind of warrior energy that I like. Some people like that kind of warrior energy. Finally, somebody's doing something about it, that
Yeah.
kind of a thing.
Enforcing
But picking up
borders. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Somebody, being grabbed and thrown out of the country is a very warrior thing to do. Negative warrior in my mind.
Mm.
So the gods will be there, invited or not, as Jung had written over his door.
Yeah.
And so similarly, I use a different variety of that. I say, you do the gods or the gods do you. And so, either you do Mars or
I
Mars
like
does
that.
you. And when Mars does you, it's not very nice. And when you do Mars, you better be aware of what you're doing with that Mars, or else you could hurt other people. So
Yeah.
true
And
for
and
all,
Mars not tempered by like a lover energy is probably going to be destructive.
not necessarily. There's wonderful Mars energy, which is, there's that beautiful story there's a poem about a butcher who butchers an ox, which is, I think it's a Chinese story. And it's absolute, it's amazing. The emperor watches his butcher knocks. It's a whole long story just about cutting through, not touching the bones anywhere because he has such amazing precision. It's a very beautiful martial poem. And yes, even if you're a vegetarian, you don't believe in, that we should kill animals, all of that, put that aside for a moment. The act that is being described, the beauty of the act of cutting and knowing exactly where to cut and how to separate parts and how to cut the fat from the what's worth keeping and these kinds of things is a martial skill, and there's beauty in that. Just like there's beauty in martial arts. That's why arts is
Hmm.
the second word of it. And so it's that the cultural connotation, because we have such limited, because in my mind, if you ask me why, because men have been running things for way too long. We have a
Well,
very
particular
negative
kind of men.
particular kind of men have been running things for too long. Thank you. So that we equate, Mars with machismo. Well, that's a
Hmm.
tiny little slice of Mars. That's too much Mars. It's not
Yeah.
all the other things that is defending and standing up for and cutting through, cutting off the fat and these kinds of things that are very valuable. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Very, very
there are no good or
useful when it's appropriate to the situation. But like with martial arts, I've practiced martial arts my whole life, and with this archetypal view, I can see what was involved with that, what it was giving me, and it was not, I've been to martial arts schools where it was all Mars. It was about fighting, and that was it. Very kind of regimented, not a lot of soul. And then you do something like capoeira, which has like music and this whole spiritual element to it. And I go, oh yeah, there's a lot of lover in there. There's this beautiful music that just evokes emotion and feels this sense of unity. And some of the martial arts focus more with like that kind of the esoteric, kind of magician stuff is all in there too. And I was like, wow, I was getting so much. My archetypes were really being like giving a place to be expressed and to be fed and nurtured in these kind of environments. And why didn't one martial art feel school feel good? Well, it was because it was all warrior, and so I was having a reaction to that and feeling like, oh, something's missing here. It's not for me. Um, so I see it as like they're all kind of like can be really complementary to each other. And like Mars on its own, yeah, it does. Mars is going to do what Mars does. But if it doesn't have like some of the qualities of like the lover or the magician, like that ability to analyze in order to understand how a body is put together, and if I cut just this way, I see that as like some of the magician insight into how the carver can be so skillful and precise. And so yeah, I like to see them all like working together as, you want them all working together because they all complement one each other.
They are all working together, just not always in harmony. But they're
Right.
always all of them are really all on your stage. I use the green room as a metaphor, but it's still in the same building. So,
Hmm.
they're always all present. And that's complicated. People like simple. It's much easier to put a type label on my forehead and said, I am this type, and that's who I am, and now we're done with the conversation. But it's not how I actually experience myself. So that's where we get into this, you know, complexity is not something people strive for, but it is something that is incredibly necessary to handle a complex world. And so we start by understanding that our inner life is complex and changes and is full of characters and figures and archetypes that we can access, and we do anyway. So we might as well be conscious about it.
Yeah. Why do you think that people are so attracted to labeling themselves, like finding a typological system, and then they claim that, and it feels like, okay, now I figured out who I am. But to me, it's too
It's called
rigid and
identity.
unchanging.
It's called identity politics. If I can identify with something and say I am this, then I have a sense of belonging. Then I have a sense of I am this. So people have this weird relationship to that, I've found. One of them is that I don't want to be put in a box. Don't tell me I'm a this. And on the other hand, I'm not an American, I'm a Polish American. Make sure you know what specific box I'm in and what that means. And most types are stereotypes, and most stereotypes are bad. Sure, there's some nice ones, Latin lovers and all Italians are good kissers or whatever. That's wonderful. But most of the stereotypes that come to mind, if you use any word or any kinds of people or any group, is limiting and negative and nothing I would repeat. So it's simpler. That's the reason. It's simpler
Mhm.
and it's easier to put myself in this. It's easy to walk around and say, look, I have ADD and I have a label on my forehead. That's it. Solves all my problems. Saying, my
Or
Mercury likes to
explains
be
everything, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Um, Saying my Mercury is a little bit, is overactive, and my Mercury hangs out with my Renegade all the time. My Mercury and my Uranus are buddy buddies, and so my mind is racing all the time. Is more complex and requires more response and more things you can do, but it's just as effective once you get a different. It's a different perspective. It's a different way of explaining the behavior,
Hmm.
and so we're in the middle level, but we're bringing in the archetypal knowledge that we have to understand who we are talking about.
Yeah, well, and the other thing that that does too, is you're talking about, Mercury and Uranus are always hanging out, so my mind's always racing. It's like all of a sudden I've got an image of my mind racing, maybe like a horse is galloping, and like, so what can I do with that? Well, maybe if I like hitch my carriage to it, I can like really go places, or maybe I've got to like stop for a drink of water or something once in a while, otherwise my horse is gonna
Exactly.
collapse. So
Exactly.
all of a sudden the imagination is working and engaged, and you've got like a whole plethora of different moves that you can make from that. But if I say I'm ADD and this is what it means and this is how it limits me, boom, and there's no treatment for it, um, where do you go from
Meds.
there?
Yeah, meds, pill. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so that you're the beautiful demonstration of the power of imagination and the power of archetypal thinking, archetypal psychology, archetypal astrology, because that's you're working in images all the time and in metaphors and in it's a creative process because the client comes up with these what you just said, those beautiful examples of hitching your wagon to it or running with it or seeing how fast it can go, or just like whatever you do with it. And that tells you then a lot about as the person helping, tells you a lot about the person's attitude towards those
Right.
parts of themselves. And then you can then ask the question, is this the most useful or appropriate or even healthy part for
Yeah.
you to use it? Or are there better ways to use the energy? But you don't get rid of the energy. You do something with it. You don't
Yeah.
knock it out. I mean, you could take Prozac and just knock it out, but then you're just operating, on one cylinder out of 10. What's the
Yeah,
point?
I was thinking about it, just sticking with the horse image, like that maybe taking drugs to suppress the symptom is like hobbling the horse, and you're like, oof,
Exactly.
oof.
Yeah,
Is that horse gonna
exactly.
be able to run
And
like
I'm not
that ever
against
again?
meds. I'm not against
Yeah.
meds. To me, the purpose of meds is to help people be able to stick with the images. Um, because sometimes we're so in so much pain or in so much suffering or so off, you know, kilter, whatever that kilter means, that we need some help. And so, some meds can calm us down, but the meds knock us out and remove the ability to imagine, remove the ability to have the conversation about what to do with that galloping horse. Then
Or
I'm not, then we're overdoing it. We're over medicating.
yeah, yeah, like or if the meds, one thing I hear from people on certain meds is like, just kind of following this image of the warrior in the green room on the couch. It's like their warrior, they can't even wake him up anymore. He's just like
Yeah,
out for the count.
right.
And so that's going to keep you from doing certain things in your life.
I remember reading a story that really moved me by Stevie Nicks, about having been on heavy duty meds for 30 years and what it was like when she woke up, when she stopped doing that and woke up from it. It was just absolutely like, the anger at having lost 30 years of being in sort of a coma awake was extraordinary, was palpable. And so again, that's just too much. Doesn't mean, but it's the simple way to do. If you don't know what to do as a therapist, then that's the simple solution. Just put people on drugs and then they're you placate people. You make them toe the line and quote unquote function. And
Yeah, yeah,
so
you help them adapt to the sick society.
exactly. Exactly. So and that's and again, I fully get it. People have responsibilities and they have bills to pay, and all of that is
Hmm.
absolutely real. I'm not negating any of that, and sometimes it's just a total luxury to be able to go inside and do some work. I also believe that unless we create the space to do that kind of work, it's just, people are going to keep running into walls because there's no other way that I know to really get to the core of things. You have to go to the bottom layer. Otherwise, you're just dealing in operations and not in the in the mission.
Hmm. Yeah. And, a lot of people talking these days about the meaning crisis. And, we get meaning from that bottommost layer of the cake. And yeah,
Exactly.
we might be kind of like satisfied with the really sugary icing on top for a while, but we're going to be lacking some kind of substance, something that fills, that fulfills us, that feeds our soul. And the soul is fed by that bottom layer. I'm sorry, this
Well,
just is
right. The soul is fed by it because that is the language of the soul, and so we're talking soul when we're
image.
talking the bottom layer image. Exactly.
Hmm. Yeah. What do you think about this thing? Oh God, I don't know how I feel about it, but this distinction or use of double language, like psyche versus soul. And I try to understand, like, well, what is meant by psyche? Because it's kind of used interchangeably and sometimes used to distinguish it from soul, like in the Jungian world. Where are you at with that?
I'll give you a double answer. First of all, maybe you remember in our talk, seems like so long ago already, when I asked you what you meant by Neoplatonism, because we
Hmm.
have lots of different ideas what they are. One of the things I learned from my father is when people use big terms like soul or psyche or any words like that, anima, whatever it is, ask them what they mean because there's 100 people in the room and everybody has their own idea about it. So that's my first answer that I would ask follow-up questions. There is a specific difference in how probably most people use soul and psyche and soul and psyche. Um, to me, actually, they're interchangeable. But I also use the term because of how most people use it. But I use the word soul slightly differently in the context of my work because I deal a lot in soul purpose. And so that's kind of my specialty in astrology. Why am I here? What did I sign up for this lifetime? Even if you don't believe in multiple lives, what is the story there? And so that implies a certain idea, and that idea is the idea of reincarnation, that the soul travels through many lives, and in this life, it's got its particular mission. So that's how I talk about soul, which is separate from your personality, which is all the archetypes and all the stuff that's going on inside you. In other words, the archetypes take on a certain form in this lifetime and then they die when you die. I mean, that incarnation of them dies. And then if you incarnate again, then the same 10 archetypes are there, but they have a different form because of a different circumstance, different astrological constellation, different family that raises you, and so forth.
Hmm.
Which all becomes middle layer stuff. But the soul is that part that doesn't change, that doesn't die, that carries the knowledge, the memories, maybe even the wisdom of everything you've learned in other times and places. That's why there are old souls and younger souls, without criticizing, just that some people have been around more times than others.
Hmm.
Um, and so, to me, that's how I would differentiate between the soul. So the soul would be that part that doesn't die in my mind, and the psyche or the inner life. Sometimes I even use mind because it's easier for people to understand.
Yeah.
Is basically that inner life that can be described in great detail by the archetypal palette of the planets.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Yeah, I always think of psyche as it's mind, but we have to then go, well, not just your conscious mind, but also this, the stuff that you're unconscious of. So it's kind of like I think of it as like maybe big mind or something like that. But yeah, soul is a different thing for me, and I like the
Mhm.
way that you differentiated because I'm also like I don't know from a young age. I had this idea that I was born into this family with all of its problems and all of the ways I didn't fit into this family. But from a young age, before I knew anything about Plato or Jung or Joseph Campbell or anybody, I had this innate sense that my soul chose to be born into this family for a reason because I had certain lessons to learn. And all of these difficulties I'm experiencing are the lessons
Right.
from a very young age. And then, I grew up and I discover Jung and Platonism and all this. I go, oh, wow, it kind of fits with this. And so I was like a natural born Neoplatonist in some ways. I think of myself as like a Taoist Neoplatonist. um, but so even that, like that kind of innate knowing of this like deeper story that came in with me because I definitely did not get that anywhere in my upbringing. I didn't get it from
course. And I
Mr.
mean,
I didn't get it from Mr. Rogers or Sesame
yeah,
Street. That's
exactly.
for darn sure.
Yeah, it's like, people who tell me, well, Mozart wrote concerts when he was 3 years old because his parents treated him the right way and gave him the right
Right.
environment.
And
It's
if
just,
I
just
if I play Mozart for my fetus, my growing
exactly.
baby, it's
Yeah,
going to be like the prodigy.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's just not, yeah, exactly. So I have great interest in prodigy and in children who have, amazing children. I find that fascinating.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I think your description there is very much so. I've had a similar thing to me. I've always known what it's like to die. It's not nothing I can prove. It's nothing I'm afraid of. It's nothing I can argue with anybody about because how am I going to prove that? But I've known exactly what it's like to die since I was born, and I'm not afraid of it for 1 second. So we have these things that we bring in that are weird, and increasingly that's being studied now. There's these whole studies about Asperger's children and their gifts and abilities to remember past lives and things like that.
Hmm.
All of this is becoming more and more sort of like standard fare, just like talk about aliens is standard fare 30 years ago. When I came to the States 40 years ago, if you told someone you were an astrologer, or if you thought there was going to be weed for everybody or gay marriage, people would have looked at you cross-eyed. And now astrology is incredibly popular, incredibly mainstream, and incredibly sure there's still a lot of skeptics and people who don't want to admit that they believe in it or things like that. But
Hmm.
again, we've covered that today, what that really means and what that's really about.
Hmm.
I'm not interested in those conversations. Life's too short. Give people a disorienting dilemma experience, and a reading can really be that. And they will either get curious or run out screaming and saying, "Don't ever talk to me about this again." So that to me that's where the rubber hits the road in that sort of literal sense.
Yeah, I like that. When I first started out as a graphic designer, I worked designing labels for this little microbrewery, and their tagline was "Life is too short for boring beer." And I agreed
I
with
love
that,
it.
and I agree with you that life is too short for these, conversations with dull people who just won't open their mind to the
They're
mysteries.
not dull, they're afraid, and I'm not going to judge them as being, bad people. I'm just not interested because
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
have
No, I
I don't
get it.
have the patience I make videos to explain the key ideas and then people can watch those and if they are interested and they can come and learn. I teach them. I've never done that before, but after 48 years, I finally decided to teach a beginner's course how to actually decipher a chart. And it was huge fun and I loved it. And 65 people showed up. And now we're going into phase two of actually starting to look at charts and read them and then into transits and things. But it's just such a fun cosmosinstitute.org is the place where I do that teaching.
Yeah, Cosmos with a
And
K.
with the K, right? Cosmos Institute. And she's doing a fabulous job of bringing all these wonderful teachers. That's
Hmm.
Gallery is bringing together all these wonderful teachers from around the world who are teaching all these ancient arts, in newer ways, and it's wonderful. So there's so much good stuff going on in the world that despite the horrors in Washington today and these days, it's just I'm an optimist, and I see that the counter movement, you have to have sort of the visible of the evil to have a sense of the counter movement, and otherwise there's no, the darker it's outside, the more valuable the light is. And so there's some really interesting things happening. I'm excited to be part of the teaching world now and to talk to people who are waking up in the most interesting places and getting it and finding ways out of the quagmire that they've been in and finding who they really are and without jeopardizing their lives and those of the ones close to them. There's people are finding interesting new paths,
Hmm.
and the zeitgeist is so alive and so quivering with Uranian, electric energy that, boy, when we tune into that, there's some exciting things coming down the pipeline, including AI, which, is incredibly exciting and incredibly scary as anything else that's new, but will change humanity more, I think, than even the internet did. And
Oh
and
yeah.
there's, we are at the threshold of really of a new age, this Aquarian age. It's a time for a different conversation, a different time. But it's fascinating time to be alive, and I think people who dare, eat the red pill and know they will never go back because they started to learn things on a deeper level, and it's an awakening that is a one-way street, but it is exciting, and there's so much
It's
there,
true.
and there's so much to learn. It is a rabbit hole, and you don't come back from it, but it's a wonderland.
Yeah.
And so, wow,
Yeah.
more power to
When
those who have the courage.
yeah, when you've had that what do you call it, the disorienting experience?
Dilemma, yeah, the disorienting dilemma.
Disorienting dilemma. There's no going back. You can't unsee what's been seen. You can't put the
Exactly,
blinders back on.
exactly.
And so I think the best thing is to learn some tools on how to navigate these deeper waters. And astrology, archetypal psychology, which includes things like tarot, all of that is really helpful. It gives you like a starting map at least for the new territory that you've entered, and then there's so much to explore. So then it's like kind of amazing.
Yes,
It's
and
like,
find your own creative connection to source, whatever that is for you. If that's meditation or yoga or standing on your head or running or poetry or building something or or playing with children, whatever it is for you, find a way to become really comfortable to connecting with source and plugging in.
mhm,
Because that's where the cool ideas really come from. They're not your ego that are creating them. We don't create anything. We just listen,
yeah,
and all the ideas are out there. So tapping in, those people who are successful in finding ideas um, are good listeners in my mind. That's where the cool stuff
mhm,
comes from. So the next step for you, what is it? What does your gut tell you? The gut has much better information than your brain. And by the way, half your brain is in your gut. But it's just like instinct, trusting, taking risks, and also knowing that taking a risk means you might fail and fall on your face, but that's also valuable, and that's also part of the puzzle
mhm,
that you're creating about yourself, and laying that puzzle piece is useful. It's this is the year of the renegade. This is the year of activating that renegade in you, that when you're in your renegade, you've activated that part of yourself, your Uranian side. When people do a double take, when they say, "What's with you? Are you nuts? Are you crazy? Are you weird?" If you hear those words, you're in your renegade. That's a good thing to hear right now.
yeah. Oh, that's interesting because I've lately just been speaking up more for the role, the value of the role of the outsider,
Hmm.
and how important it is for there to be a counterculture, an underground, all these kind of words. Like you think the culture's really fucked up? Well, then join the counterculture. Come along. We're swimming upstream, but we'll be more effective if there's more of us, and we'll find some camaraderie and solidarity there. So tell me about
Exactly.
how this is the year of the renegade. I mean, is that an astrological read?
No, that's my read because
Hmm.
of what's happening, and that it's for exactly the same reason you said.
Right,
It's an
like what's
astrological read,
necessary.
right? It's an astrological read because Pluto's in Aquarius, and because we're in the Aquarian age, and because the United States is going to have its Uranus return, and yada yada yada. There's all those sort of technical things you can back that thinking up, but I look at what I'm observing, and why it's so important to have counterculture, and not to say, what, I can't take it, I can't stand it, I'm just going to hide my head. A lot of my friends are thinking about leaving the country. No, it's not the other side's country. It's our country. It's everybody's country. So if they're going to create a country that I can't live in, then that's not good. On the other hand, if we're going to create a country that they can't live in, we're still having a we and they dilemma. So how do we
Hmm.
create dialogue? How do we create unity? How do we create a melting pot? These are the original ideas of the country. That's what's going to make it work. And I am absolutely sure that that's not gone. I think what's happening right now is a backlash from a recognition. My father wrote about this a long time ago, about the white male being afraid of losing his power, which he's losing, and so this is a desperate move. I think that's what Brexit was about. This is what
Hmm.
Trumpism is all about. This is what it's all a desperate move to reclaim that power status, get women back in the kitchen to have babies and cook my food, and then everything will be fine. Sort of simplistically, the manosphere world, the isolation, the loss of income and of education to women and foreigners. It's all very threatening to white men. So I think my solution to that is not to throw all white men into the ocean, because I'm one of them and I don't want to be thrown in the ocean, but instead is to do what it takes to deal with this new world, which is to basically activate your right brain. And that's to me the work that needs to happen, because men are very much stuck in their left brain,
Hmm.
and that's got its whole own longer thing. But we need to activate our right brain. And to do that, we need to learn a language that speaks right brain. And archetypes is my language for it, but there's lots of languages that speak right brain. Music does too, imagination, love is a right brain language. These are right brain languages that can't be measured, but they're just as real. And so we need to turn the light out on the right brain and turn the light on the left brain so we can be rational and practical and critical and even discern about all the junk that's coming our way and not just send it on to the next person, but to trash it because we can and we have that ability to be basically good journalists and know how to deal with information and double check and triple check our sources and these kinds of things. We can all do that now, but most people are too lazy or they just don't want to.
Hmm.
So or because they're stuck in a model where they're in an echo chamber where when they hear the things they want to hear, they feel good. That's short-lived, and especially when the reality doesn't fit that anymore, you get into cognitive dissonance and it becomes really difficult to step out of your house and then you just become, afraid. So my recommendation for people is to learn a right brain language. Doesn't matter who you are. Some right brain language that works for you, that activates your imagination, that allows you to dream, value your dreams as your greatest gift that you get. Don't think there's some crazy kind of brain farts that happen at night, to rehash what happened during the day. No, these are
Hmm.
much richer. It's your quickest step in. You can have a dream tonight and it can change your life. Trust that active imagination is a great tool. We have so many different ways we can get into developing a right brain language. That's the solution for me to these people. And there's not just men, but they're mostly men who are stuck in a left brain model. And so they don't get what's happening and they're operating on half of their brain. And so, I value left brain stuff. I have an engineering degree. I'm
Yeah,
a geek. I like to compute.
me
I
too.
like to do practical things. Love all that stuff. But
Hmm.
that's not enough. I don't live there. I'm just as good on my right brain. And I value that as much. I like to think of myself as a whole brainer. So
A whole
that to me
brainer.
is
Yeah.
this, yeah, that's the solution. But for that, you have to have access, and it's not so easy in a culture where men aren't really invited. Because if you do right brain stuff, then you're a sissy, or you're not man enough, or what the hell does it even mean to be a man these days? I
Yeah.
mean, think about that. This is a really difficult question. Ask 20 kids who are 10 years old, you'll get some very strange answers
Hmm.
because these things are changing. And what it means to me is to
Yeah.
operate with a full brain, to have full access to your right brain and to your left brain.
Yeah. Um, the kind of the sacred marriage of the
Yes,
masculine and feminine, but more than that, all of these different parts, at least 10. At least 10.
at
Probably
least 10.
probably more. And okay, I
At
think
least
it's
10.
it's so telling though, like what you're talking about the left brain thinking, this kind of outdated masculine ideal, all of that. One of the things that I point to people is like look at the leaders in many countries, but like the US is getting so much attention right now. Do you think any of them could recite a poem by heart? Have you heard any of them sing? Have you seen them dance? Have you heard them tell like a really good joke? What's their sense of style? Like,
Th-
what's being
uh,
left out here?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
are
And
these the
most of
people
them
you
are
want shaping your
correct.
country? Is like with no sense of aesthetics or
That's a
beauty
great,
or
great observation. Beautiful observation. And also and they're all pretty much, boring white men, most of them.
yeah.
And
And I
it's just
mean
like,
white in
wow.
that there's no color. And
Yeah.
like I don't identify as a white man, even though my ancestors are European mutts. It's because I'm a colorful person. There's nothing white about me, and there's nothing pure about me, and there's nothing superior about me. So the white does I don't fit white. Sorry, you have to be more
Yeah.
differentiated. You have to be a little more complicated. I know it's not a
Yeah.
shorthand. Sorry,
Yeah.
but
No, I get what you're saying. I'm talking about just as a shorthand.
I know.
It's yeah, and but that's where the power is. And
Hmm. God, the aesthetics of the right are just awful. Like as a
yeah,
designer, I'm offended by every time I see something that they make, like one of their banners, or it's just like, ugh.
as an architect, I'm the same way, believe me. So, yeah, it is scary. But anyway, there's hope. I'm an optimist, and I think of a dragon. When you cut the dragon's head off, it can do a whole lot of damage with that tail, whacking
Thrashing
around and
about in the death
thrashing
throes.
about and
Hmm.
destroying a lot of things in the death throes, and that's where we are. And no, this is not permanent. This is, yeah, it might take 10 years, who knows? But this is 10 years is a blip in history. And
Yeah.
you remember when Saddam left Kuwait because he was being in, Kuwait was being invaded by the Allies. Remember that?
He was being
Remember what he
hunted.
remember what he did? He lit all the he had invaded Kuwait, and then
I,
he lit all the oil
the
wells on fire
refineries. Yeah.
as an FU to the world and to those who are, you're not going to get it. That's what I feel is going on.
Yeah. It's like the
Um,
salting of the earth.
Exactly. It's a salting of the earth, and so we have to be strong and absolutely join the counterculture wherever you can to make that going. And there's great stuff going on. The humor is going really, really well. If you have the energy, watch Jon Stewart. It's so cool. There are a lot of good things out there that
Mm,
really, I'm a big, big fan of Desi Ledick. I think she's fantastic.
mm.
Um, and there are some people out there who do it with humor and which is, fantastic that we live in a society where that's possible. In many societies, you get shot for that.
Hmm.
So we have to
Well,
accept and
give it time, Lawrence. I mean,
well, yeah, I'm not a pessimist like that. I think the American people, remember everybody has a gun here, so it's a little bit different. I think people are going to get pretty
mm,
mad if they take those kinds of things away of being able to say what you want to say. I can follow all the conspiracy theorists about, it's one more step towards Nazism. I get all of that. And I see, but we're not in 1939 and we're not in Germany. It is a different background and a different story. And so I'm not afraid.
well,
I
and
am concerned.
yeah, I mean, part of the internet's power is, yeah, the people can use it for propaganda, but we can also use it to stay
Exactly.
connected in that underground, in that
Exactly.
mycelial network.
Exactly.
And so it gives us more power.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, yeah, this is great. I want to end it here because we
We could
brought it
talk all
into
day.
like, well, and how, and how is this not all just navel gazing, but how does this like help us navigate the turbulent times that we're in, you know? And look, I think I'm a pessimistic optimist. I just think that things will get bad enough until change happens or we're forced to change or wake up or whatever it is. And I think we're in that difficult time now and we're really feeling it.
Yes, and so this is not navel gazing because people need to explore their own who they are so that they can be part of this greater society that we're in. And if they run out madly, as do-gooders with no clue of who they are, then they don't even know what they best can contribute with because they don't know themselves. And so to know who you really are is a first step. I do believe in therapy and navel gazing and astrology and whatever tools you need to figure that out. That's all great. Just don't get stuck there.
Yeah,
Use that to say, and here's how I can make a difference in the
right.
world and ask that question. It's what Thurman, the judge, what he said, something like, ask not what the world needs of you, ask what makes you come alive, because what the world needs is people who have come alive.
Hmm.
I follow that. Thurgood Marshall. I follow that dictum. I think that's a really good line. So
Yeah.
come alive, find out what your mission, your purpose, your life is about, who these archetypes are, what they want, what kind of an alien you are in your family and why you're different to everyone around you and why you needed to have them to learn the lessons that you've learned, just everything you said so beautifully. Follow that. That's great. But then afterwards, step out and take that passion to the world and make a difference. And if that means joining the counterculture or having serious conversations with the other side, whatever it takes, do that.
Yeah.
But if you're drinking the Kool-Aid, then that's your fate. That's your story.
Hmm. Yeah. I like to think of it as finding your ecological niche.
Yep,
Like
exactly.
there's some part of the world that needs your kind of your unique puzzle piece. There's a space for
Exactly.
you to fill out the
Yep,
bigger
exactly.
picture and to make it more
Right.
colorful and diverse
Yeah,
and integrated.
right. Exactly. So yeah, so using the puzzle metaphor, you remember those pictures of the AIDS blankets that were made and left all over the Washington over the mall, those beautiful image of that patchwork of all those little tiny
Hmm.
pieces put into blankets. I think of it a little bit like that as a metaphor for humanity, and that we take our own puzzles as we figure out the image that we are. We don't have to do this when we put the last piece in. We can do this as soon as we want and put that puzzle next to other people's puzzles and start to see a much bigger picture that is emerging for humanity.
Yeah, that's nice. I like the image of like normally when we get the puzzle, it's got that hard edge, and that's how you know where to begin. You start with the hard edges, the defined edges. But maybe another way to look at it is a puzzle that doesn't have those hard edges, but it can interconnect with all the other puzzles that people are also working on. So different kind of puzzle, yeah, that interlocks with all the rest.
Mhm. Mhm.
Something about that I'm gonna stick with for like the
Well, bricks
giant
have
puzzle, and I've got like my one area that I'm responsible for working on, but it's
like,
like part of this bigger one.
but maybe, bricks have a hard edge, and together they make walls. And so the mortar is to me the
Right.
passion and and the longing, and the being alive
Shared
and the being
values.
human. Shared values is the mortar, but everybody's brick can be separate. That's fine. But we still, again, it's the sand corn on the beach. It's a grain of sand on the beach. That's an individual separate thing, but it is in the collective, it's part of a mass thing. And that conversation is worth 3 days worth of talking, what that really means, the me versus the us, because that's the Aquarian dilemma, and that's what we're
Hmm.
getting into now. But we're not ready for it unless we've done the Piscean era, dilemma of integrating left and right brain, which is, still not there at all.
Hmm. Good stuff. Okay, so Cosmos Institute, you're doing a live course, but you've also got now the previous course pre-recorded that people can still watch. And I would
Mhm.
say, just personally, I know there's so many trainings out there, so many workshops. I think one of the great things that Cosmos is doing is they're getting great teachers, but it's actually quite affordable comparatively.
Yep.
And so it's really accessible, high level teaching. Like most of the people on Cosmos are, staff or faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute. So it's kind of an alternative school that is really accessible but very high quality, which I,
Thank you.
I
Yeah, and
love.
also her model is that's a purpose for her, that she wants, more people to have access to this stuff, and then keep it affordable, and also that she makes them, shorter. That she makes 9-week courses, so an hour a week. People can do 16 weeks, which is the standard sort of university length is a lot. And so, but that's one of the places I teach. People go to my website. They can find laurence.hillman.com. They can find stuff there. The Archetypes work is at archetypesatwork.com. That's one word. And yeah, and so I'm also teaching at Pacifica 2 courses this year. So, it's all over the place. I'm going to be at Oxford teaching there. And so there's things still coming out. My schedule is still developing as we speak. So a lot of teaching. That's where the universe keeps pointing me. So I keep going.
Great. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thank you, Brian. I told you it would take longer than we thought, so here we are. It's been a total pleasure.
Wow,
I
two and a half
enjoyed
hours almost. Great.
I enjoyed talking with you. Have a lovely rest of the day.